The video references the research of Bart Ehrman on these topics.
Knowing. How would we know? We can't know.
I really don't know how many of you are aware of, Bart Ehrman was absolutely defeated in debate by Bible translators.
Men who, upon studying the same materials, have come to polar opposite conclusions. We don't have the original. So it made me suspect that maybe God wasn't that interested in giving us his words. If he was, why didn't he give them to us? That was my question. The other has found those same materials, soul anchoring assurance.
The problem is nobody would really know because no one understands what they're saying to each other. Using terms and talking about things that no one knows what they are. I certainly didn't. You can quite understand their opening presentations because the explanations they knew they could provide us. But then once they get into the crossfire, they put their motors on and went up at full altitude.
I can tell you what will happen if you copy the Gospel of Matthew some evening. You will make mistakes. There'll get time where your mind will wander and you'll make mistakes. The copy would have been copied. And the problem is when somebody copied the copy, they not only copied the original words, they copied the mistakes that the first scribe had made. I have something like 5,500 copies in Greek. Copies of the 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 original. We can put it in relative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. The repetition of the bare fact that there are more variants in the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament without proper historical context is grossly misleading. There was never a time when any one man or group of men had control over the text of the New Testament, already displaying multiple lines of transmission. This results in the textual variants we must study. The vast majority of the variants are non-meaningful. Next, we have non-viable. There is simply no possibility that this variant was original. Graphically, we can see the situation as presented by Dr. Ehrman like this. Here we see a more meaningful comparison, that with the variants that actually impact the meaning of the text. Whether these variants have a chance to be original, the situation changes even more. We have a dozen manuscripts within the first 100 years after the writing. They represent a majority of the books of the New Testament and about 4/10 of the text. I'm asking what the manuscripts are. I know P52. P32 is quite possibly that early as well. P32 is dated to the year 200. Talk about T.C. Skeet. When does he date P32? I don't believe that he addressed P32 specifically. I believe that his was a manuscript of John. I think that this number 12 is exceedingly high. We have more than 120 manuscripts within the first 300 years. 120? Yes. That's still probably high. In every case, one of the variants is the original text. Is that your understanding? Yes, I don't believe we need to fill in gaps as we do with most classical works. And I also find it to be very consistent with my own study of the textual variations in the New Testament. Okay. Coming out of the early period, that if there was some kind of primitive corruption, you would have multiple corrupted lines coming out. You call it an Alexandrian manuscript.
Alexandrian manuscripts. According to James Snap, they typically have a reorganized style in terms of grammar. Alexandria is the intellectual elite. And as can be pointed out, most of the oldest papyrus are found in Egypt. The climate in Egypt is ideal to preserve the material.
I have worked on sections in seminary, yes, sir.
Another common text that's worth mentioning now because of what they're going to be talking about later on is the Western text type. This, according to James Snap, usually has an expanded out phrasing.
P75 from around AD 175, and this manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, from AD 325. More alike than any other two ancient manuscripts, 150 years separates the copying. This means we have a very accurate line of transmission back to the very earliest part of the 2nd century. You're not seriously going to contend that P75 and B are not in the same line of tradition, are you? They represent two different lines within that stream. Have you ever collated a Byzantine manuscript?
A Byzantine manuscript. Caliphates were established. Most of the New Testaments that were being produced was around the area of Byzantium from this point forward. Along the Byzantine text, there are some Western textuality types and some of the Alexandrian.
You collated an Alexandrian manuscript against a Byzantine manuscript.
I've never put B against a medieval minuscule, no.
Okay. The minuscules come later, hence James White calls them medieval minuscule.
Using the TR, it's not even a Byzantine manuscript.
It is not purely Byzantine because it draws also from some other sources with it. Most of them are about 1200 years after Christ. The editions of Desiderius Erasmus, the edition of Stephanus, Theodore Beza's Greek written in the 5th century, and Western textuality.
You would find just under 6,600 differences, or a total of 95% plus agreement, at the widest point in the spectrum. Here we have Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 15. One difference.
We do not have a high priest unable to sympathize with our weakness, tempted though he was in every same way, though without sin. The difference is the word pepeirasmenon, which means tempted, sympathizing with us in our weakness, all the same as us without sin.
Here's Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 15.
Two phrases that mean the same thing. If an angel descends from heaven and preaches a gospel contrary to the gospel we preach, versus from heaven against the gospel we preached.
Here we have an ancient text, conceivably be a first or second generation copy of the original. Same words.
The Greek text that was produced in the 19th century, taking together all the manuscripts that they had at this point, including an apparatus at the bottom, that's used to translate the most of the English translations today.
He put a manuscript on the screen that was the oldest manuscript. He doesn't point out that there's a significant textual variant even in this credit card-sized fragment.
Do you have access to a textual variant there that is not listed in the Nestle-Aland text?
It's the absence of the words eis tuta before elelutha.
You would consider this to completely change the meaning of the text?
No.
The difference between the two, this is Jesus talking to Pilate and says, "For this reason I was born, and for this reason I speak, bearing witness to the truth." Versus, "For this reason I was born, and I speak, bearing witness to the truth."
Confess, I felt a tremendous connection to this ancient fellow believer. P72.
Other documents are found in P72.
There are some non-canonical documents.
Includes Psalm 32, Psalm 33, the epistles of Peter. There's even something in there written by Melita of Sardis, one of his paschal sermons.
Do you think the scribe thought that what he was copying was scripture?
We all know the difference between which is Holy Scriptures and which isn't. We don't count the books of the Bible in one book, the Bible, until later. It's not a Bible. It's not supposed to be one.
There are all sorts of works that were considered to be very beneficial for the reading of people.
I just thought that it was odd that that particular manuscript is one that you resonate with because it's the earliest attestation we have of the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi.
Time?
Yeah, he gets cut off here. But that was a snidey shot by Bart Ehrman. And yes, it also does include, he was wrong, it's not the Proto-Evangelion of James. This person must have been deceived by the Gnostics. And he has the Odes of Solomon carrying it around with him in his notepad. They were making fake gospels, forged letters.
List for us some variations in the New Testament where you are willing to assert that none of the extant readings in the manuscript tradition could possibly be the original.
1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19 follows a creedal statement about Christ, suffered for sins once and for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order that he might lead you, textual variant there, to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but having been made alive in the Spirit, in which also, having gone forth, he preached to the spirits who are in prison for grammatical reasons, but also because they think that in fact it might be a mistake, that in fact this is talking about the early Christian tradition about Enoch, who was preaching. So, I mean, it strikes me that that's a plausible place where you might need an emendation.
You have often said that there are verses where variants change the meaning of an entire book.
Hebrews 2:9 said that Jesus died apart from God, that there is no place in Hebrews then where Jesus is said to have died by the grace of God. A full flesh and blood human being without any divine comfort or support. If the reading is not by the grace of God, then in fact you do have the teaching that Jesus' death was an act of divine grace in Hebrews.
I understand that, but you believe that the original is chorus because that is consistent with the writing of Hebrews, with the theology of Hebrews.
And the variant changes that.
Away from it. Okay, I understand what you're saying. You do believe that Orgus Theis is the original there?
That's right. There are solid reasons for thinking that it was Orgus Theis. The leper comes up and wants to be healed, and it says Jesus got angry. And so, that's a little hard to figure out. No wonder they changed it to he felt compassion for the man. I mean, it makes sense that they would make the change.
Actually, but I think I figured this one out. This is a case of a scribal error in the dictation, and neither of the men would be able to comprehend. This time it's not public school's fault. It's because of seminary.
En ho kai tois en fulake pneumasi parutheis.
Not like the official Greek language.
Sungenis.
No one speaks like
it's
that.
Sungenis, but it's his use of heos who. Not just heos, but heos who.
James, if you should see this, I tried to tell you once in a comment, you should try watching cartoons in Greek to get the pronunciation right. I do it, works for me. And if I'm less than officially speaking Greek, I would love it if some Greeks could tell me. This is a problem in dictation and scribal hearing.
In the Gospel of Mark. By the way, he doesn't get angry in Matthew or Luke.
If you listen to men like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, you will often hear Dr. Ehrman's name cited as the final authority in the scholarly demonstration of the corruption and utter unreliability of the New Testament.
You didn't really think there was evidence for Jesus existing. We go through Bart Ehrman. So
yes, there is Professor Ehrman's a very excellent book, but if you didn't have Professor Ehrman's book...
With Christianity, it is a textual claim about the veracity of the Bible. And of course, we don't have the original manuscripts. We have copies of copies of copies, thousands, literally thousands of discrepancies between them. Whole books, like The Shepherd of Hermas, which you probably haven't heard of, but for centuries it was considered part of the canon, and then was later jettisoned as false gospel.
I don't think either man really has a clue what Bart is actually talking about, but that does not stop them from invoking his authority. A few weeks ago, I debated Dr. Zulfikar Ali Shah, Islamic scholar and apologist at Duke University. 2 of the 4 books on Dr. Shah's desk were by Bart Ehrman. At one point, Dr. Shah informed us that all we had for the New Testament were copies of copies of copies. I had to smile.
With the biblical narrative, now let's read the books of Bart Ehrman. That the scholarly works like the works of Bart Ehrman indicate very well Matthew, Mark and Luke. John is the oldest one according to Bart Ehrman, and these sources come, as he said, about 100 years after Jesus Christ.
I do not believe Dr. Carter has any meaningful understanding of the field of textual criticism, but he is representative of many in academia today, who are more than happy to blast the New Testament and smugly proclaim to 18-year-olds that scholars have proven it to be an unreliable document.
And I want to open by saying that a decade or so ago, I took a college course on the history of comparative world religions that was based on your collective works. This was a community college here in Dallas.
Cool.
Mark Hanshaw was my professor, and it was a very good class.
Bart Ehrman cannot control the use of his words. As far as any of these have misused his comments, the responsibility lies with them. The fact is that Dr. Ehrman has had many opportunities to correct these misapprehensions, and strangely, he doesn't. I have listened to NPR interviews where the interviewer is going on and on and on, and instead of correcting their many misapprehensions, Dr. Ehrman allows them to go on unchallenged.
Welcome to Apologia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians and tap into the decades of research and knowledge of a former Christian renowned historian, like Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Thanks for having me.
The fact of the matter is, if you're going to tell people repeatedly that we don't know what the New Testament originally said, when at the same time you admit that the manuscript tradition of the New Testament is earlier, fuller, and better than any other relevant ancient document, then you need to be fair and honest and balanced, and at least inform your listeners the majority of those who have studied this field believe the original readings do continue to exist, at least up until postmodernism, in the manuscript tradition to our day, even in the relatively small number of viable, meaningful variants. To do otherwise is to use bare sensationalism, such as unworthy of this important topic.